Welcome, friends. My name is Jeremy Rutledge, and I'm senior pastor at Circular Congregational Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And I'm so happy to welcome you to this evening's Spring Lectures in Theology and Ethics. Thanks for bearing with us during this initial technical glitch. I think we've got it solved, and I think and hope that everyone is able to tune in. I wanted to quickly thank our Circular Church Endowment for underwriting these lectures so that they could be free and open to all. Thanks to Catherine Cullinan and Tyler Ung for organizing the event, helping us with all the technology, especially in the last 10 minutes. And thanks for each of you for being with us for this conversation. A word on our format. Our hour will be broken into 3 parts. We'll have a lecture by Professor Nguyen, then we'll have some brief conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from the larger group. You're invited to enter your questions into the chat or comments at any time. And let me move quickly and offer just a brief introduction. Viet Nguyen teaches at the University of Southern California. He is the author of Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, The Sympathizer, which won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, the story collection, The Refugees, and most recently, The Committed. Most importantly, Professor Nguyen, through his teaching, writing, and national voice, has become one of our most vital public intellectuals. Writing in The New Yorker, Jonathan Dee recently called him a conscience of American literature. And he was right. Friends, it is a delight and an honor to welcome as our teacher for this evening, Professor Viet Nguyen. Welcome, Viet. We're so glad you're with us.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeremy, and hello to everybody out there who I can't see at the Circular Church. It's a real pleasure to be here to speak to you tonight and tomorrow, even though on subjects that are not perhaps so pleasant. Tonight I wanted to talk about being Asian American in a time of anti-Asian violence, and then tomorrow I'll talk about some related issues around the ethics of remembrance, especially as it relates to our nation and some of the issues that we're going through. But I thought it would be important to talk about being Asian American in a time of anti-Asian violence, simply because we are living through a period of accelerated anti-Asian feeling and sentiment in this country, which has manifested itself through both rhetoric and also violence as well. And I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, California. And the history of anti-Asian violence has always been something that's been on my mind because of where I live. Here in Chinatown, for example, in 1871, 19 Chinese men and boys were murdered by an armed mob. And that incident of anti-Chinese violence was not atypical for that time period in the late 19th century. Many incidents of anti-Chinese violence manifested themselves during that time. And they would foreshadow what we're going through today. So of course, there's been the massacre in Atlanta where 8 people were killed by a shooter, 6 of whom were Asian women. There was the FedEx murders not too long ago. 8 people were killed, 4 of whom were Sikh Americans. And just in the last few days, 2 Vietnamese American men were murdered, Shane Nguyen of Fort Worth and John Nguyen of Bothell, Washington. In the cases of the FedEx murders and of Shane Nguyen and John Nguyen, we don't know for sure whether these murders have been carried out in a racist way or not, but it seems like there is a chance that that's been the case. In the FedEx murders, there was a high number of Sikh Americans who worked at the FedEx plant, and the shooter has been alleged to have been looking at white supremacist literature. And in the cases of Shane and John, these 2 Vietnamese American men, I can tell you, it's not typical that in the space of a week or 2, we would see 2 violent murders of Vietnamese Americans in this country. If those things happened, the Vietnamese American population would be talking about them. So in this time of heightened anti-Asian violence, it's inevitable that those of us who are Asian Americans and those of us who love Asian Americans might be concerned about any kind of manifestation of this experience. I can tell you that when I step outside of my door, even now, and I live in a very quiet neighborhood, when a car drives by, I get nervous about whether someone's going to roll down the window and say something or worse. And because now in my social circles, within 1 degree of separation, there have been people who have been targeted by anti-Asian rhetoric and anti-Asian violence. And of course, there's a long history of this anti-Asian violence, as I'm going to talk about today. And this history of anti-Asian violence is not exceptional in American history. I think there might be Americans out there who would say that this is not us. when they see incidents of anti-Asian violence and rhetoric. But in fact, as I'm going to try to argue today, it is very much us that anti-Asian violence is a part of this country. And of course, all of this anti-Asian violence and rhetoric and feeling has been wrapped up with the pandemic era that we're living through and this era of COVID-19. It didn't help that in the previous administration, COVID-19 was called the China virus and the Kung flu. And for many of us who are Asian Americans, we feel that this kind of rhetoric has encouraged anti-Asian violence and the taking out of frustrations and rage due to the pandemic and other issues on Asian American people. And in my own family story, and I want to start from there, we've encountered some of that anti-Asian feeling as well. We came as refugees in 1975, and I'll talk more about that family history tomorrow. But we came as refugees and we did what we were supposed to do coming to this country. That is the idea of the American dream and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. This is something that my parents did. In 1978, they moved to San Jose, California, and opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose. Again, this is what immigrants and refugees are supposed to do. And in doing that, I think that they were fulfilling one aspect of the popular perception of Asian immigrants, Asian refugees, Asian Americans, and that is the model minority stereotype, that we Asian Americans make for good neighbors, good friends, good partners, and so on. But every stereotype, no matter how positive, inherently comes with its opposite. And the opposite of the model minority stereotype is the yellow peril. And that's exactly what we encountered in San Jose, California. So my parents opened this grocery store, and when I was about 10 or 11, I was walking down the street from that store in downtown San Jose, and I saw a sign in another store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And of course, he meant people like my parents. I was too young to really understand exactly what was happening with this sign, but I wondered if this person who wrote this sign and put that sign in the window knew that my parents worked 12 to 14 hours a day, almost every day of the year in that store. Did that person know that my parents were shot in that store on Christmas Eve? Did that person know anything about my parents and what they had been through to get to this country and to become the people that they were? And of course, this person did not know and did not care to know anything about my parents, because for this person, my parents were not Americans, and therefore they were also not human or not fully human. And one of the sad things about this, among many sad things, is that I internalized this sign. And I think so did many other people that I knew. You have to understand that this sign, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese," is actually a story. Another American driven out of business by fill in the blank. That has been a story that's been repeated over and over again in American history. It's still being repeated today with different groups being put into that slot of fill in the blank. But I internalized that story and that sign. And when I went to high school a few years later, I went to this very elite high school, mostly, with white students, but there were some of us who were of Asian descent. And we knew we were different, but we didn't know how. So every day at lunch, we would gather in a corner of the campus and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. We had no other language for ourselves, but a racist stereotype that invoked the yellow peril. And 30 years later, I would come back to my high school and I would give a lecture to all the 1,600 students, and I would look out into the audience and I would realize we really have taken over. But that's another story. The irony of us young Asian American boys, because it was a boys' school, calling ourselves the Asian Invasion, is that we hadn't invaded the United States. It was the United States who had invaded our countries, or if not invaded, at least occupied our countries, and if not occupied, at least invited itself in to our countries. I'm talking here about places like the Philippines, Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. And in order to get to these countries, the United States had to cross the Pacific, which meant taking over some of the Pacific islands as well: Hawaii, Guam, Samoa. So basically, a lot of the Pacific and East and Southeast Asia would be places where the United States would make its presence felt, especially through a militarized presence and through wars in Asia. And if we think about the Middle East as the Orient, which it is to many European countries, what we've been doing in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, is an extension of these other wars in the rest of Asia. So I locate myself not just in Vietnam and in Asia, but in a history of war. Here in the United States, not just the Vietnam War, but the forever war that the United States has been waging for most of its history. Another way to understand this is that I am a refugee from an American war in Vietnam, and I'm also a citizen of the United States that has been engaged in a forever war. And it's a very painful contradiction for me to be in, and a painful contradiction for a lot of us. And when I was that boy, seeing that sign in that store window, it wasn't the only incident of anti-Asian feeling that I would see. In the early 1980s, for example, my family bought a VCR. I'm assuming everybody in the audience is old enough to know what a VCR is. But the first movie that I saw on that VCR after Star Wars, which I watched a dozen times, the first movie after that was Apocalypse Now. And I watched it because I was a war buff. I was just fascinated by war. And I think that was partly because I was a boy, but also because I knew my presence in the United States was due to war. And mostly I'd watched American war movies, rooting for the Americans. And I realized that Apocalypse Now was a movie about my war. And I knew nothing about my war. So I watched this movie. And I was rooting for the American soldiers in this movie until they killed Vietnamese people. And then I was split in two. Was I the American doing the killing, or was I the Vietnamese being killed? At 11 or 12 years of age, which is when I watched this movie, at much too early of an age, I didn't know how to process those feelings any more than I knew how to process that sign, another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese. But years later, in college, I would be asked to recount a scene in a movie that was important to me. So I decided to recount this scene of American soldiers massacring Vietnamese people on a boat, which I hadn't thought about in a long time. But as I recounted that scene, I found myself shaking with rage and anger. And I realized then that stories are powerful in a very visceral way. Now, of course, I knew that stories were powerful in the sense that they could save us, because I was saved by the stories in the public library, in the books that I was reading to distract myself from the refugee life that my parents and I were leading. But I didn't realize that stories could also destroy us. And I think that's really important to acknowledge. When we look at the history of American wars in Asia, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that these are acts of anti-Asian violence. These wars killed millions of Asians, and they were carried out, if you read the accounts of soldiers, oftentimes carried out with a great degree of racism that might be denied by our politicians and by our generals and so on. But the soldiers on the ground definitely carried racist feelings with them to Asia and sexist feelings and brought them back to this country where they continue to circulate. And they continue to circulate at the level of stories. Another American driven out of business by fill in the blank is a story that is connected to these acts of anti-Asian violence. And a movie like Apocalypse Now and all the other movies that have been made about Asia have in many ways served to contribute to anti-Asian feeling and contribute to destroying us. Now, you who are a part of the majority, however you choose to define that, whether it's racial or sexual or some other way, this point about the capacity of stories to destroy you may not be obvious. Because if you are part of the majority, all the stories are about you. That is one of the privileges of being in the majority that many people in the majority don't realize. And I call this privilege narrative plenitude. Almost all the stories are about you. But when you're in the minority, almost none of the stories are about you. We live as minorities in narrative scarcity, with so few stories told about us. And in that environment, stories really do matter. When you're a part of the majority and you encounter a story that's not very good about someone like you, you can dismiss it and say, it's just a story. And it is, because you have 1,000 other stories to turn to. When you're a part of the minority, you don't have other stories to turn to. And when you're Asian or Asian American, it's especially painful to see these kinds of stereotypes and racist representations of Asians on the screen, which people in the majority can dismiss simply as stories, but which we as Asians or Asian Americans know we cannot dismiss. Because seeing Asian people killed on the screen can eventually lead to seeing Asian people killed on the streets. And that realization made me want to become a writer. And I followed in the words of Muhammad Ali when he said, writing is fighting. That was my way of trying to fight against anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian feeling, and to claim a place for Vietnamese refugees, Vietnamese Americans, and Asian Americans in American society. And one place to carry out that fight is in the realm of memory. In my book, Nothing Ever Dies, I started off that book by saying that all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. Now, Hollywood refought the Vietnam War through movies, and I've seen almost all the movies that Hollywood has made about the Vietnam War, which is an exercise I recommend to nobody. In these movies, if you are Vietnamese, you realize that this was our war and this was our country. But in these movies, we have no voice. We can say nothing except to scream, to curse, to speak gibberish. And if we can say something, all we're expected to say is thank you. And so these movies that reenact the war in memory also repeat the violence of the war. The anti-Asian violence that's being seen on screen is repeated as anti-Asian violence here in the United States in the form of symbolic violence that silences and dehumanizes Asian Americans. So stories do matter, and speech does matter, and things like Kung Flu and China virus and another American driven out of business by fill in the blank lay the conditions and the groundwork for the anti-Asian violence that we're experiencing today. Now, Asian Americans, in the face of actual violence and symbolic violence and economic violence, have often felt the need to defend themselves by one, proving their humanity, and two, by claiming Americanness. I'm going to address the humanity claim and its problems tomorrow, along with talking more about these issues of memory. But today, for the rest of our time together, I want to talk about this idea of claiming Americanness. Now, a lot of Asian Americans today, in light of this anti-Asian violence, are saying we're Americans too, and we've been here for centuries, and you're not getting rid of us. And it's a claim that resonates, I think, with many other Americans. Why not? And my former teacher, Maxine Hung Kingston, a great writer, in her work, The Woman Warrior, has said that claiming America is an absolutely essential part of what it means to be Asian American. And that claim has been fundamental to the formation of Asian American communities and politics and representation here. And if we go back into American history and look at how Asian immigrants and refugees have been treated, we can see why claiming America would become so important. In 1875, the first act, legal act, passed against a racial group in terms of immigration happened, which was the Page Act. It was an act that said women of low morality would not be allowed into the United States, specifically Chinese women. And the point of this act was not simply to keep out Chinese sex workers, but really to keep out all Chinese women. And this was followed through with the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was aimed at eliminating almost all other Chinese immigration into this country. So the Chinese were the first undocumented immigrants in the United States because they continued to want to come into this country despite the Page Act and the Exclusion Act. Nevertheless, these acts were successful in greatly reducing Chinese immigration. So the United States turned to Japanese labor to take the place of cheap Chinese labor. So Japanese people started to come in the tens of thousands. And of course, what happened to Japanese Americans was the internment of 1942 to 1945, when 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them citizens, were put into what Franklin Delano Roosevelt called concentration camps before Americans realized that that was not a term they should be using. So that is an act of anti-Asian violence as well, the mass incarceration of people based just on their race. And of course, the Japanese, after they were excluded in 1907, were replaced with Filipino labor that came in the tens of thousands. Filipino men, for the most part, working on the West Coast, they too were subject to racist persecution and violence. There were small numbers of Indian and Korean immigrants that started to come in the early 20th century, they were subjected to marginalization as well. And the exclusion of Asian immigrants wouldn't really begin to end until the 1940s, when the United States would figure out that that looked really odd to be fighting a war for democracy and freedom and yet be enacting racist immigration laws at home. But it wouldn't be until 1965 and the Immigration Act of that year that things really would begin to change. The 1965 Immigration Act eliminated exclusion and racist quotas, and it led to what we have today, a time period in the last 60 years or so where the immigration to this country has really been remade, and many Asian immigrants have come here with some predictable consequences. But in 1966, that's when we first hear the term model minority in a Newsweek report, the characterization of Asian Americans as a model minority. And that's a perception that still is with us today with some very serious implications. In 1968, college students in California, UCLA, UC Berkeley, San Francisco State, decide to call themselves Asian American instead of allowing themselves to be described as Asians or Orientals. And it's a landmark moment, this period of history, 1965 to 1968, in terms of Asian American population growth and self-representation in this country. And that moment of 1968 and the coining of the term Asian American was very important to me. You know, I went from that high school where my friends and I called ourselves the Asian invasion to going to Berkeley, where I took Asian American studies classes and joined the Asian American Political Alliance and was immediately radicalized as an Asian American. That was my entryway into feeling that I could belong to this country in an anti-racist way. And you have to remember that in 1968, the term Asian American, as it was coined by these college students and as it was implemented in the Asian American movement, meant taking a political stance, not just around identity, but a political stance that involved being against war, against racism, against imperialism, against capitalism, oftentimes being pro-Marxist, and being committed to solidarity with other people of color. So that the political protests that the Asian American students at Berkeley and San Francisco State were involved with, for example, took place in conjunction with what was called the Third World Liberation Front. This idea that all of us would have to join together in order to liberate ourselves in the United States, but also to liberate ourselves in relationship to our colonized brothers and sisters and siblings in other countries outside of the United States. Now, many, many decades later, the term Asian American, I think, has become a huge success. People in the 1960s wouldn't have said Asian American very easily. Now, it is normal to say that one is Asian American or to talk about Asian American this or Asian American that. So there's been a great expansion of the Asian American population and the terminology of the Asian American. So Asian American, to be Asian American today, possibly still does evoke some of the things that I talked about in terms of radical politics, but just as often, or even more often, to be an Asian American today is to evoke being a consumer. Where's my boba tea? That's a real crisis right now. Is to invoke representation. Are we being represented enough? Is to invoke networking in the corporate and economic sense. And so, not surprisingly, Asian Americans today, in the face of anti-Asian racism, are asserting we are Americans in all of these ways. And that is complicated and potentially contradictory. Because what does it mean to claim being American when being American also involves colonization? Now, we're a settler colonial country. We wouldn't exist except through the act of colonization. And arguably, we are still a colonizing country if you ask indigenous peoples. To even use the term colonization, however, is obviously controversial because many Americans would deny that the United States is a colonizing country. Colonization supposedly is something that Europeans did, not Americans, because we are an exceptional country. But in fact, I think we have been a colonizing and still are a colonizing country. The difference is that we don't call colonization by that name in this country. Instead, we call colonization the American dream. That's how we incorporate that into our sense of our own mythology and our own ideology. And that American dream also includes fundamentally anti-Blackness as well. So now, in this moment, anti-Asian violence, the relationships between Asian Americans and Black Americans can occasionally be tense because some of the perpetrators of anti-Asian violence have been Black people. And so if you go read social media, you'll see that there are quite a few Asian Americans who are saying, hey, why don't we call out Black people for their anti-Asian racism and prejudice? And then on the other side, you'll see some Black people saying, why don't we call out Asian Americans for their anti-Black prejudice in their businesses and so on. So there are all these recriminations that are taking place between some Asian Americans and some Black Americans. But it's heartening to see that there are also many Asian Americans and African Americans who are expressing solidarity with each other, right? That the leadership and the activists in the African American and Asian American communities have committed themselves again and again to the necessity of solidarity. And it's important that Asian Americans acknowledge that that African Americans have done this and that we ourselves are doing this as well. And I think the reason why this is so crucial is because colonization, and I'll talk more about colonization tomorrow, but colonization divides and conquers. That's how it maintains its power. Racism maintains its power by dividing and conquering. Capitalism maintains its power by dividing and conquering. So for Asian Americans and African Americans to turn against each other, to be pitted against each other, simply serves the interests of colonization, racism, and capitalism. All these things happen simultaneously. We, who are people of color, all take our turns being targets of racist violence. And it's simply at this moment that Asian Americans are now in the front line of this kind of racial violence. And the response to that should be, in my opinion, solidarity. Solidarity against division, solidarity against fear, solidarity against competition. The more powerful classes want us to be divided, to be fearful, to be competitive with each other, because if we're all these things, we're weaker. So we have to be stronger with solidarity. And I want to conclude with an incident that you're all familiar with, a tragedy that you all know that hopefully will illustrate some of these issues around divisions and solidarity. An incident, a tragedy that seems local, but it's actually quite global. And that, of course, is the murder of George Floyd. And we've seen that there's been one small step towards accountability with the conviction of Derek Chauvin. But there are 3 more police officers to be tried, and one of them is Asian American, Tu Tao, Hmong American police officer who stood guard as Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. And Tu Tao is the son of refugees, Hmong people from Laos, came to this country through the war, like me. And so I feel a sense of kinship with Tu Tao as a Hmong American, as a fellow Southeast Asian. But he's also unlike me. I'm a professor, he's a cop. We have different class positions, we have different upbringings, we have different realities, but we're both here because of this global history of war and being refugees or being from refugees. And this idea of being Asian American, which is so capacious and so necessary to mobilize us as a community against racism, is also a formation that erases differences. We think about the Hmong, for example, people from Laos who fought with the CIA in the war in Southeast Asia. 1/4 of the Hmong population died during this war fighting with Americans. If we think about the Hmong refugees and Hmong Americans, one of the things we should acknowledge is that when they came to this country, they did not become the model minority. The privileges and the perceptions of the model minority were not extended to the Hmong. The national poverty rate in 2015 was 15.1%. For African Americans, that rate was 24.1%. For Hmong Americans, the poverty rate was 28.3%. That's complex. What we have in the murder of George Floyd is a white police officer killing a Black person, an atrocity that descends directly from slavery and the international slave trade and the dehumanization of Black people then and now. And we have a Hmong American police officer who comes from a population that shares an economic status similar to African Americans, but who can participate in anti-Black racism as a way of becoming American, deflecting the dehumanization of Hmong people through dehumanizing others by participating in this crime. So these global histories are always with us. They're multiple, they're intersecting. The United States was built on slavery and has expanded through war. And these two forces of anti-Black slavery and anti-Asian war brought George Floyd and Tou Thao together. And that's the fraught place of Asian Americans today, offered the opportunity to belong to the United States and also demonized as outsiders to the United States. And being Asian American is one response to this dilemma. But in and of itself, it can't succeed through a claim on a complicated American. That claim has to be articulated, not through identity, not through belonging, but through decolonization and the acts of solidarity if we were to have any hope of overcoming the interrelated problems of anti-Asian violence and anti-Black violence. Thank you.
Mm. In church, we say amen. So I'm gonna start with that. Thank you for the challenge and for the truth. I wonder, Viet, and we probably need to move quickly, and we'll bring some other guests in with questions. But just listening to you, I think I remember you saying once in talking about the forever war and talking about the American culture of being at war. I think I remember you saying that imagination was in play, and those who would resist war fight for the imagination and not the nation, or fight for something larger. And I wonder if you might hear that in what you're saying about fighting against racism, sexism, the other forms of exploitation that have been mentioned. Would you just share a little bit about what the role of imagination might be, or how it might help us in this moment?
Well, I think you and I probably share something in common as a pastor and as a writer, that we need the imagination, right? We need the utopian dimension of what the imagination offers. And I grew up as a Catholic, by the way, so I think I'm pretty familiar with narratives of utopia, as well as of love, kinship, solidarity, sacrifice, justice. These were the values that were inculcated into me through my Catholic education. And that very elite high school that I went to was a Jesuit high school. So they've done their best to address some of the things that I mentioned in my talk, right? And so I believe that imagination is crucial, whether that's the imagination of the activist, and I think of Jesus Christ as an activist, the imagination of religious leaders, and the imagination of artists. That our obligation, I think one of the obligations that writers have, at least the kind of writers that I'm interested in, is to expand our imagination, both expand our imagination in the aesthetic sense, because I think that's still important, but to expand our imagination in the human sense, in terms of the possibilities of who we can identify with and what we can imagine as a society. So literature and art is really crucial in this act of the imagination. And I'll talk about this more tomorrow, so I don't want to give too much away, but that they're based on empathy, which doesn't, empathy is crucial for this ability to have solidarity with others who are not like us. That doesn't mean that in the end, what we have with the imagination is sentimental or is only designed to make us feel good about ourselves. In fact, I think that's a terrible thing. That the capacity for imagination and empathy can both help us to imagine a better world, but in order to do so, it has to take us sometimes through our worst aspects, which is why I wanted to end with this note about George Floyd, Derek Chauvin, and Tou Thao, that we have to understand the complexity of what that means if we want to get to that moment of utopian justice.
Right. Exactly. With that complexity in mind, let's bring in a couple of other friends. I think we have Fu Lu, who many of us know. He has recently written a book of Asian American liberation theology entitled Jesus of the East, Reclaiming the Gospel for the Wounded, which is a wonderful look at an Asian American liberation tradition. And we also have Marjorie Wentworth, a longtime poet laureate here in South Carolina and a wonderful truth teller. So Marjorie, I see you first. Can we go to you with the question?
Sure. Well, since I'm a writer and I teach your books, I would like to ask you about, your fascination with your characters' motivations and behavior as a way of explaining, some of the behaviors that you spoke about a few minutes ago. It seems like there's, the politically committed ideologues who follow blindly, and then there's the apathetic people who practice silence, as Dr. King said, the appalling silence of good people. And then there's your protagonist who the double agent who plays both sides of the fence, which obviously was a very conscious decision on your part. So I'm just wondering which kind of person in your experience, if I'm not saying those are the only three categories, but for our purposes, for my question, which is the most dangerous, in your opinion? The ideologue, the apathetic person, or the person who's not committed?
Margaret, thank you for your question. It's a hard question because it's a little bit hard to rank those types and see what might be the worst. And I think the two books, The Sympathizer and The Committed, where this narrator, the sympathizer, appears, is designed to work through exactly that question. Because, not to give away too much about these books, but in the end of both these books, the narrator, the sympathizer, is offered moral and political choices that are literally life and death that he has to undertake. And in one version, I think he has, obviously in the second book, The Committed, he has to express his commitment. He has to do something. And in the other book, it's a meditation or contemplation of what doing nothing might mean. And I think the point of me doing that in both books is to say that these acts are relative. They depend on the circumstances. Sometimes it's better for us to do nothing. Sometimes it's better for us to do something. Okay. And I think that, part of the point that the books are trying to make is that, for many of us, we actually already have, I think, the moral equipment necessary to discern what we should do. The issue is, can we do what we know we should do? And these are the decisions that each of us makes within our own minds, our hearts, our souls, our own inner struggle. And I think that I can't rank these different types because I think they work in concert. The ideologues, the committed, the ones who believe utterly in what they believe in, depend on the apathetic and the apolitical, and the ones who do nothing to ensure that they go along with what it is that the committed want to take place. And of course, we do need committed people. I mean, again, this is part of the complexity that the novel The Committed undertakes. Like, we need committed people to undertake the task of justice. But to be committed can also be really dangerous. Yeah. Because we've seen it over and over again throughout history. I don't think I need to point out examples where commitment becomes a kind of insanity taken to its extreme. And that respects no ideology, no ideological boundary. It's not a partisan issue. You can point to right-wing and left-wing manifestations of revolution where idealism turned into horror. Right. And so, politics is not about making one choice or the other, but it's about trying to negotiate and make these very complicated ethical, moral, and political decisions. And that's what animates, partly what animates those two novels.
Thank you.
And Fu, can we go to you next?
Yeah, chào anh. I'm glad you and Jeremy talked about your religious background growing up Catholic. So my question is a theological one coming from my background. So as you know, Christianity came to Vietnam as a colonizer religion. And in your work, The Sympathizer and The Committed, you have many references to Christianity, many images. I'm just going to read one passage from The Committed to our audience. If Jesus Christ, child of refugees, born poor in a stable, a colonized person, a hick from the backwaters, despised by his society's leaders and by the rulers of his leaders, a humble carpenter, if this Jesus Christ became universal, then so can I, motherfucker. So I chuckle too when I read that. But I'm wondering, how can Christianity be something meaningful to people who were colonized, those in Vietnam, and also to people here in the United States, Vietnamese here in the United States? How can Christianity as a Western colonizing religion be meaningful when Christianity, Western Christianity, doesn't look very different from ideals of U.S. capitalism, nationalism, etc., that you had noted?
Well, thank you for that. I have not been quizzed on religion since I was in high school at the Jesuit Preparatory. I will do my best to answer the question. I have to answer it slightly autobiographically before I go out larger. And that is, my parents my mother's passed away, my father's still alive. They are deeply devout Catholics, deeply devout, which actually makes them pretty much like every other Vietnamese Catholic I know of their generation. And, in their retirement, their idea of fun was to go to church every day. I mean, literally every day. So they took great meaning and strength from their Catholic religion. And I grew up in that household, watching my parents, for example, pray the rosary every single night and then dragging me to Vietnamese mass every Sunday and other kinds of torturous exercises. And so I grew up with a sort of resentment about Catholicism because I didn't have the spiritual component of it. I just saw it as discipline and punishment. And then, of course, I had this sort of inherent skepticism of sort of like the apparently I'm just like genetically rebellious or something, but, I just didn't like the spectacle of the Catholic Church and all of its various, from my perspective, hypocrisies and contradictions and inconsistencies and so on. But then what my interpretation of of Christianity is that, the social justice part, the revolutionary part that Jesus Christ represents to me is a powerful one. And what I absorbed that stays with me is that idea of sacrifice and martyrdom. So there's the two novels, for example, there's a very easy way in which one can go from being a Catholic to being a communist, because the way I present it in these books, they're very similar. They just worship different gods, but the rituals of sacrifice and martyrdom are, to my mind, really actually pretty similar. And that's probably how I could go from being raised in a Catholic way, coming out an atheist, and yet transpose myself into this context of social justice that's been so powerful for me. So the culture of a certain kind of liberatory Catholicism has been really crucial for me, not the culture of the Pope and the Vatican and all that kind of stuff. But then I also think about what Catholicism meant in Vietnam, and you probably know much more about this than I do. But, Catholicism, in one sense, Vietnamese Catholicism is really conservative from my experience. I mean, Catholicism is conservative. Vietnamese people are conservative. You bring them together is like really super conservative. But perhaps at some point in history, Catholicism was actually liberatory for some people in Vietnam. I mean, we think back to this era of feudalism and I don't know what else is inequality, all this stuff. Maybe the message of Catholicism that we're all equal, we're all the meek who are going to be redeemed, the weak are against the powerful. Maybe that message really was much more radical at some point in a certain context for my ancestors. And apparently it gave them great strength. Again, I think about my mother, my father, all the other Catholics that I know, they're really good at enduring at suffering and putting up with that. And so, of course, that was read one way by the communist regime during and after the war, where Catholicism remains a threatening foreign presence, as you're saying. But in other cases, that message of Catholicism can have a social justice context in different ways than I would understand it. Like, I don't see the institution of Vietnamese Catholicism in the United States to be liberatory for me, but perhaps Vietnamese Catholicism in the feudal Vietnamese context and against communism is liberatory. So much of this issue of religion, how it's implemented, to me, seems so contextual, based on the society we're talking about, the people we're talking about, and the implementation, because not all Catholicism is the same.
No, that's very good, because what I try to connect is, here in the US, the enslaved reappropriated the religion of the slaveholder Christianity, and create their own liberatory way of expressing their faith, and in a very real and viable way. So when they sung hymns, it was about actual liberation from their slave masters and slaveholders. So in much the same way as perhaps Catholicism in Vietnam helped some Vietnamese to break free of certain bondages within the communist system. That's very good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And I wanted to read one that's come in. This is from Tyler Ung. And the question is, these are his words, so I want to read them. Finding an identity of being Asian American as opposed to Cambodian, which is my father's ethnicity, felt like the most authentic way of naming my culture. You mentioned the tension inherent in the name of being both colonized and colonizer, and I hear the dynamic process of evolution in it. What new name might you suggest to invite us all into solidarity today?
Great question, Tyler. I think we all have many names. We all have the potential for many names and many identities. I face this, for example, as in my writing life, because oftentimes I'm introduced as the Vietnamese American writer. I'm like, well, okay, I am a Vietnamese American writer, but I'm also just a writer, so there's so many labels that can be put just on what I do as a writer. And I don't have a problem with any of them: Vietnamese American, Asian American, refugee, writer, just plain writer. Because I think, as I implied in the answer to Anfu, the everything depends on context, and there are so many different contexts, and we have different personas and different tactics based on the context that we find ourselves in. So the problem is not in a name, but the problem is in having only one name. If I was only called a Vietnamese American writer, I would get really annoyed, but I can do that in certain contexts. So here with Asian Americans, I think it's very similar. I'm not advocating that we shouldn't have this name of Asian Americans, that there is no utility to it. I think there's enormous utility to it. And the utility comes from the very particular context of the United States, that for people of Asian descent, we have been oftentimes exploited and mistreated and persecuted here on the basis of being Asian. And so therefore, it makes sense to organize ourselves around being Asian American, especially as the political and cultural system of the United States rewards us for doing so. By organizing around race, by organizing around numbers, we get greater leverage and visibility in the United States. So it's a tool that we can't give up. But we have to make a distinction between something that's a tactic and something that's a strategy. For me, being Asian American is a tactic. Like, I think we have to deploy it in certain circumstances. And the danger is when it becomes a strategy. If the end goal is simply to be an Asian American, that's a mistake. Because as I said, simply being an Asian American in and of itself, as if that's a sole good, allows you to be commodified, to be co-opted, and to participate in larger systems of domination and exploitation in the United States, where being an Asian American is not a tactic for liberation, but is a tactic for ever continual refinement of a capitalist and colonizing system. So we have to make that distinction that, in certain circumstances, we need to be Asian American to get what we want, but the larger strategy should be one about social justice. I mean, that's where my political consciousness didn't come around because I wanted to be Asian American. My political consciousness came around because I wanted justice. And the injustice that was immediately in front of my face was anti-Asian feeling and anti-Asian racism. But I think so many of us have forget what the larger project needs to be, this larger project of social justice, economic justice, equality for everybody. And so if that's the case, if that's the larger strategy, that's the larger goal, then being Asian American is one way of getting there, but it's not the end point. And so we need to make that kind of a distinction. Now, the name I've given the strategy that's useful for me at this moment is decolonization, to think about, and again, I'll talk more about this tomorrow, to think about race and racial differentiation and being Asian American as outcomes of this much longer, larger history of colonization that is global and that includes the United States. And that if we want to dismantle that system, we have to engage in decolonization, which will liberate everybody, including Asian Americans.
Wow. I mean, that seems like a really wonderful segue to tomorrow for our time together and getting us ready for that time. I wanted to thank you, Viet, on all of our behalf. So you can see some of us on the screen. There are many others who are tuning in. And thanks to all for bearing with our technical difficulties. We'll meet again tomorrow, and we will do some troubleshooting in the meantime to make it a little smoother. Thanks to all, and we look forward to seeing each other again tomorrow night. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you, Anfu. And thank you, everybody out there.
Come
Hopefully
on,
we'll see you tomorrow.
Edmund.
Bye.
Bye, Marjorie. Bye, Jeremy.
Bye.
Blessings, Tyler, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good night, friends.
Have a good French class.